So I'm interested in particular in issues of enslaved women's wet nursing, in infant and child feeding, and also increasingly in the collective feeding of enslaved adults as well, and how these manifest themselves in terms of enslaved people's wider familial networks. Essentially, I'm seeking to highlight the relationships between enslavers and enslaved women in terms of how food was distributed, prepared, and eaten. I want to know what these patterns reveal about enslavers' power and women's attempts at agency and resisting the regime, as well as their sometimes complex relationships with the feeding of others itself. And I want to say just something at the outset about regionality and temporality, complicated word, because I normally get asked questions about regions and change over time. I normally get asked questions about how patterns varied among larger and smaller slaveholding sites and whether they changed over time. So my caveat here is that, as is the case with a lot of the evidence that I have, it tends to come from larger slaveholdings of wealthier enslavers, because these are the people whose documents survive in archives. And a bit of a spoiler alert, when I've been looking at evidence from the enslaved and formerly enslaved, I'm not getting trends coming through very clearly about temporality or regionality, but I am happy to talk about this in the Q&A. So in some ways, I think my research questions might appear a little bit conventional. I want to know more about enslaved people's cooking. I'm interested too in growing, in horticultural traditions. I'm interested in enslaved people's gardens. However, I don't want to go over more well-trodden ground here, so excuse the pun, thinking about gardens, and instead I want to cast new light on aspects of the regime that I think are really important, that are gendered and that are also relatively under-researched as well. And namely, that is the fact that I think how enslaved people ate has been relatively overlooked by historians. How people cooked and consumed food, be this individually, within nuclear or more extended family groupings, and this is where I think this project ties in with what I've done before, or whether they ate more collectively. So other authors, and sorry, this is a very lazy slide where I threw a load of books on my study floor, but other people have undertaken some really important and seminal research, despite this book being on my floor. Might have someone got muted there, maybe? Yep. Okay.
Or maybe not.
Sorry.
Could we ask everybody who's attending online, please, to turn your microphones off, because we have a breakthrough of that. Those voices.
That's okay, no problem. Yeah, but other authors have taken really important research into what enslaved people ate and their cooking methods for preparing food. They've done important research that really celebrates Black food cultures in the United States, as well as noting the extent to which food cultures drew upon African, Native American and white European influences. To name just a few, we've got Jessica Harris, whose book High on the Hog also was recently a Netflix series as well. So if you prefer to learn things visually, I really recommend High on the Hog. We've got other authors such as Anne Boer, Robert L. Hall, Frederick Opie, Tony Tipton Martin. And other people have perhaps written in a less celebratory way, more really about the cultural appropriation of African-American food practices from slavery right through to the present, including Michael Twitty, who's kind of a public historian in this realm, Angela Jill Cooley, Jennifer Jensen Wallach, and Syke A. Williams Forson. So I'm not suggesting these lists are all encompassing, but I just want to give due credence to some of this work that's been done already. And then somewhat differently, if we go back a little bit in time, there's an earlier generation of mostly economic historians who spent quite a lot of time dwelling on this question of whether enslaved people were, I'm doing warning quotes already, well fed. Mostly, they did this by investigating the rationing system used by enslavers. I think this research is quite problematic, to be honest. It ends up conceptualizing enslavement within somewhat dated and racist tropes about alleged good versus alleged bad enslavers, and it ignores structurally racist and sexist power structures that enable the regime's survival. And the idea of being well fed in itself, if we actually think about it, is really, really problematic. Certainly, some enslaved people receive sufficient calories for sustenance, if not sometimes even more, but their diets were extremely monotonous and boring, whereas we know that food, of course, can and should bring joy and pleasure. So the part of my project that relates to the system of rationing has also been a bit problematic, because I think that rationing fails to reveal some of the questions I'm interested in. A typical distribution of rations, for example, and there was an image of this on the first slide. A typical distribution might be a peck, which I believe is the equivalent to 2 gallons of cornmeal or flour, half a pound of salted pork or fish, sometimes milk and molasses or other similar items as well. But surviving evidence, whether this is from enslavers or the enslaved or formerly enslaved, often fails to specify exactly who received this distribution. They simply write in this passive voice that rations were distributed. So sometimes then enslavers gave rations to so-called heads of households. By this they mean men. Other times they seem to have distributed rations individually, sometimes with children receiving smaller amounts depending on their age. Also relatively well researched among historians of enslaved people and food has been the way in which people supplemented their diets by growing their own produce in gardens or patches. These were often situated around cabins and worked by all members of enslaved households. People might then barter or sell their fruit, vegetables, eggs, sometimes livestock such as poultry, either in informal economies, in local markets where permitted, or sometimes they even sold produce to enslavers. Other enslavers too, they didn't allow these individual familial gardens, but they permitted enslaved people to tend one big communal garden, if you like. And this system was common but not exclusive to the so-called task system of labour, utilised instead of the gang system by enslavers in coastal cotton and rice regions of the Carolinas and Georgia in particular. This is where enslavers tasked people with working for rather than a set amount of time to do a certain amount of labour, and thereafter their time would be their own. So gardens are important. They give people a sense of autonomy and independence, especially when men, it's mostly men who can do this, can hunt and fish at weekends as well. It allows people to get away from the prying eyes of enslavers, even though sometimes this system actually shifts the burden of provisioning and providing onto people who are already exhausted. So it has a duality as to a lot of the things I'm talking about today. So the image here shows a mapping of some of the enslaved people's gardens at Monticello, which seem to have been relatively collective in scope. Although when I spoke to people there, they weren't. Again, people don't really know the extent to which gardens were based around individual families or more collective. Okay, so is there anything new that anyone has to say about enslaved people and food? I think there is. And I think what I want to do today is to provide a new lens through which we can use food to think about gender, power and resistance. Recent histories, for example, of capitalism and slavery have tended to overlook the really, really important role of women and reproduction in the generation of profits. So there are important exceptions here. Again, I want to give credit to other historians, not least the work of Jennifer Morgan and Diana Payton, both of whom have drawn our attention to the law of partus sequiter ventrum, which meant that enslaved children followed the status of mothers and spread throughout the Atlantic slave system, having been established in the colony of Virginia in 1662. And if we think about it, you know, the feeding of enslaved people, a practice typically associated with women across all sorts of different contexts, is absolutely crucial to the regime's efficiencies. Enslavers needed people who were healthy enough to work, to be sold, and in the case of women, to reproduce. Moreover, because enslavers assigned women with the tasks of feeding other enslaved people, as well as white families, of course, which we know more about, food often placed women at the forefront of conflict with enslavers, providing them with specific opportunities for resistance, for example, through the illicit distribution of food or through poisoning. These are exciting topics, but my work is actually less concerned with the women who cooked for enslavers and who attempted to poison them. That's already been done. For example, you can look at the work of Kelly Fanto Dietz here. And I'm much more interested in women who fed the enslaved. So we know that cooking is a form of gender depression. Preparing food for men, noted Jean Boydston, has traditionally been regarded as part of a marital contract. And this is true even under the extra-legal forms of marriage utilised by the enslaved. Women have been expected to feed children too, as well as husbands. Cooking is, therefore, and has been both oppressive and meaningful. And I think this is important. It really gets to the heart of some of the ways in which I'm grappling with these sort of multiple perspectives, I guess, on feeding for women. And it's also a topic of interest to more contemporary feminists within more modern contexts as well, I think, some of whom have inspired my thinking here. For example, Lola Olufemi writes that while making food and sharing it with loved ones is undoubtedly a source of pleasure for women, it can be boring and arduous work to perform. It's a demonstration of love, of course, but labour's needed to make this act possible. So in my work, I'm trying to centre more Black feminist ideologies, epistemologies, if you like, about food, move away perhaps from sort of more traditional second wave activist ideas that regarded food preparation as simply a chore that ironically could be delegated to other women and spared yourselves. So the dynamics of slavery obviously are crucial here as well. They further complicate women's relationships with food. Enslavers typically assigned women with what they saw as domestic tasks, feeding the young, preparing and distributing food to others. And they also wanted their women to do this in public rather than private spaces. Again, we need to sort of break down, if you like, this binary between a sort of private domestic world and a public world that is somehow undomestic. Enslavers restricted women's attempts, to create autonomous cooking and eating cultures, and they sought to impose efficient communal feeding regimes to minimise time lost from labour, as well as food waste. So communal food preparation and consumption obviously maximised the time that the enslaved, whether men or women, could labour elsewhere. And such notions chime with manifestations of power and authority exercised in other repressive regimes and within institutions as well, such as prisons. For example, and I've been told off for making this comparison once before, I'm not comparing the regimes, but I'm simply illuminating a different example in this context. Authorities in the early Soviet Union, bear with me, in the 1920s and 1930s, waged a battle against what they disparagingly called private kitchens. They argued that private kitchens were backwards, reactionary. They kept women away from the labour force. They condemned women to domesticity, the inefficient preparation of food that failed to best prioritise nutrition. Soviet authorities initially built many apartments without any private kitchens at all, instead decreeing that people should instead eat collectively in large canteens. They packaged their rhetoric in a language of liberation for women, but women themselves, of course, actually lamented this loss of autonomy, the ability to cook for themselves and their loved ones. And eventually, the Soviet regime moved back to permitting more familial-based cooking. So I find this a helpful example in terms of thinking about how I'm trying to develop some of my own arguments here. And as a slight aside, Eugene Genovese, writing in the 1970s, from whom an awful lot of work about enslaved people's eating has been derived, he actually echoed, perhaps unsurprisingly, this early Soviet ideology when he noted in the 1970s, when he wrote that the enslaved people preferred to eat in the privacy of their own quarters when permitted. It's a really important point here. Although he believed communal kitchens to be much more economical and healthy. Yeah, what a surprise, Genovese. Okay, so enslavers, obviously, they predated the Soviet authorities in seeking efficiencies through women's collective food preparation and consumption, but there are similarities there. Enslavers maintained gendered assumptions about women's roles. The idea that women are innately associated with the domestic, which is something I've been thinking about today, reading Rachel's book, thinking about women in domestic spaces and what domestic spaces actually mean. Enslavers also attempted to frame the ability to cook for one's own family at night as a really important privilege in keeping with paternalistic ideology. It was something that could be granted, but also withdrawn. So viewing cooking in this way allows us to move beyond this alleged binary that has existed until fairly recently, certainly in the late 20th century, between capitalism and slavery, adopted by older generations of historians, including Genovese, of course. The rhetoric of paternalism actually enabled the regime's capitalistic development in the emerging modern world of the 19th century. I just want to say a few words about my sources, and then I promise I will get on to saying a bit more about it. I draw upon Works Progress Administration, or WPA, interviews with the formerly enslaved that took place in the 1930s, published autobiographies, contemporary travel accounts, such as Olmsted, who writes an awful lot about rationing, but typically says a lot more about the types of food that was distributed than to whom the distribution was made. I also look at the writings of enslavers at this time, especially prescriptive literature and postbellum reminiscences as well. And then finally, thinking methodologically, I'm also inspired by ideas about life cycles as well. And my forthcoming book includes chapters that actually sort of move through people's life cycles, looking at women's feeding, for example, of infants, younger children, older children, and adults as well. So my research also develops some of the arguments I made in 2007 in a co-authored article in the Journal of Southern History with R.J. Knight about enslaved women's wet nursing, which again I'm happy to sort of talk more about in the questions. Wet nursing was really what got me started in thinking more widely about this eating. What I want to do is I want to give you an example of a story about a woman. Upside down. That's my wet nursing article with Rosie, and now I want to move on and give you an example about a woman who fed other enslaved people and who worked as a wet nurse, to give you a kind of an idea of how I'm using evidence in this book. So in 1914, I'm in the 20th century now, Alice Bruce Power, a white Southern woman, wrote a letter to Mrs. C. Lear. And Mrs. Lear was a historian working for the United Daughters of the Confederacy, sort of a lost cause organisation, if you like, that sort of lamented the demise of slavery and looked back on it with nostalgic eyes. Historians here were interested in collating reminiscences of what they called mammy-type figures on plantations. And these are women who typically fed, cooked for and fed white enslaving families rather than the enslaved. We know now that mammy is a dated racist trope, a stereotype that says much more about nostalgia for slavery during the post-war era of the lost cause than the lives of women themselves. Former enslavers often conflated mammy with women they termed nurses. This word has been the bane of my life. It's ambiguous, it's amorphous, it's of multiple meanings across time and space. It includes, for example, to breastfeed, to care for children, to nurture the sick, to wet nurse as well, so to feed children who aren't your own. And firmly ensconced within this realm of the domestic that relegated and belittled enslaved women's labour as forms of a kind of innate care and nurture again. Nursing, I think, in all its multifaceted forms, encompassed a significant amount of the challenging, arduous, and sometimes emotionally exhausting labour of enslaved women. Alice Bruce Power described in some detail an alleged mammy figure on the enslaving family's homestead, a woman named Maria. I think through careful reading of this evidence, alongside with some supplementary evidence as well, including the census and other secondary sources, we can shed more light on Maria's life and what she did. If you like, I'm using evidence about her from other sources to try and place her more at the centre of a narrative, rather than leaving her stereotypes on the margins merely as a symbol of lost cause nostalgia. Power's grandfather, Henry Bruce, and his family left Virginia for Kentucky when he was a child. He later married Eleanor Threlkeld in 1798, and they built their family homestead in Fleming County in 1814. That's what you can see here on this slide. Sorry, it's a rubbish photo. I just got excited in the archive and took a picture. Their first child, George, was born in 1800, at which point Henry's mother, deep breath, Mary Stubblefield Bruce Morrison, Southern names, sent from Virginia the gift of Maria, an enslaved girl, just 4 years old, to care for the baby. Her role was to rock the baby's new cradle, also sent from Virginia by the proud new grandparents. And I think we can only imagine how Maria must have felt at such a tender age, seemingly gifted alone without any other family members. Over time, the Bruce family grew larger, including at least 3 daughters, one of whom, Harriet, was Alice Bruce Power's mother. The White family subsequently put Maria in charge of these 3 little girls, and she slept in a newly built room with them. As she grew older, Maria became more important to the Bruce family and increasingly regarded through this prism of the mammy trope. She apparently lived in the largest cabin, with all other enslaved people's cabins surrounding it. It had a huge fireplace within it, and Maria was in charge of this fire, which was never allowed to go out. So again, we need to pause here and think of the implications of this, especially in hot summer months that you get in Kentucky. When a fire was needed in the so-called big house, Maria and later her daughters had the responsibility for starting the fire in the house from this fire in her cabin. The Bruce family also tasked Maria with feeding all the enslaved children from her cabin. Most on the plantation were hired out with their mothers. This is fairly common in the Upper South. Alice Bruce Power wrote, whether big or little, they were all hired out. And the children came home on alternative Sundays, some one Sunday, others the next Sunday, and then Maria had to feed them. Their supper tended to be cornbread and johnny cakes, or cornmeal flatbread, that she baked on boards before the fire, along with roasted rabbits that hung on wires, basted with their juices. Maria actually caught the juices in the pans below as well to use in other modes of cooking. She gave the children buttermilk to drink. She also sent all the children out to pick up windfall, fruits that had dropped from the trees, which she then sorted before giving them to the children to eat. So we never hear Maria's voice in this evidence. And here she is. Hopefully you can see that. But Alice Bruce Power, I think, unwittingly reveals so much about how enslavers sought efficiencies in their feeding regimes when she's remembering this woman, Maria. Rabbit was most likely caught by enslaved men at weekends, providing a free resource, if you like. Buttermilk is a byproduct of other dairy processes. Corns was plentiful and cheap compared to other grains. And I think it's also important that the enslaved children essentially have to scavenge for windfall, which would have been bruised, much less pleasant to eat than fruit which remains on the tree. I think it's also likely that Maria wet nursed white children. Alice Bruce Power claimed Maria nursed, again, that infuriating word, the children of her mistress, recalling how she remembered seeing in Maria's cabin a little white baby at the head of the cradle, a little black one at the foot. So this racist spatial conceptualization is obviously intentional. A young enslaved child would be there, rocking the babies to sleep, much as Maria used to do when she was young. And another Bruce family descendant wrote in a different publication that Maria herself had had 2 children by the age of 18, eventually going on to have around some 15 children in total, though not all survived to adulthood, of course. We know nothing about who fathered these children, of course. But it's important that Maria and Harriet Bruce, as well as some of the other Bruce daughters, were of childbearing age at the same time. I think it's probable she'd wet nursed at least some of the white children, although we can see why, as historian Janet Golden put so well, wet nursing is referred to as an untraceable interaction. But Maria would have been lactating, and I think in this case nursing actually means literal wet nursing rather than a more generic caring. So we might not have complete evidence of wet nursing, but I think through cross-checking, for example, using census material, dates of birth, corroborating with other evidence, I think we can make assumptions about who was and who wasn't a wet nurse. And it's a technique that's been used by other historians as well. For example, Susan Kern in her study of the Shadwell plantation in Virginia. So Mariah performed what Patricia Hill Collins and others have sometimes referred to as other mothering children who's biologically one's own. She nursed white youngsters. She assumed responsibility for the feeding of all enslaved children on the homestead. I also think here of Sarah Knott's work, Mother is a Verb, about the labour, the effort, if you like, of maternal care. And while I think it's easy for historians in the 21st century to be simply appalled by the overt racism within these sources and to kind of dismiss post-Antebellum reminiscences of former enslavers, especially perhaps testimony contained in a glowing letter to the UDC that recalled slavery days with fondness on nostalgia, through deep probing of this sort of evidence and in seeking to centre the more unwitting evidence that's and kind of trying to overlook the more obvious mammy tropes, I think it's possible to build up a more complex, more nuanced version of the complexities faced by enslaved women performing the labour of care. Mariah fed these children thriftily, with ingenuity in the face of often scant provisioning by enslavers, who as a whole tended to deny mothers the ability to feed their own children during the working day. Sometimes they denied them the ability to feed their children in the evenings as well. It took time away from their labours. So instead then, there'd be a designated cook and carer who prepared children's food in bulk before they ate collectively. And they additionally had to care for these children as well. This is often thrown in to enslavers' references as if it's like an easy job to look after the children all day as well as cooking for them. So within WPA reminiscences, and of course this is interesting because most of the respondents are only children when they're interviewed, so they remember a lot about this. Nearly all respondents, mostly, recalled being cared for during the day while their parents worked by an elderly woman who also prepared all their food. So these women, Mariah or others, I really want them to form the heart of my forthcoming book, Cooking for the Quarters. I think this might be the image I want for the cover. Sometimes too, women additionally cooked for adult enslaved people, sometimes for white enslavers as well, although I'm less interested in this aspect of their work because it's already been researched. These women are often nameless in surviving testimony, referred to only in the passive voice. They're nearly all female, and they're often described as elderly, which I'm increasingly arguing is very relative and contingent concept. Over time and space, more senior women then, perhaps that's a better way of putting it, we know that they've tended to care for the young, be this within extended families or within wider communities. Enslavers knew too that delegating this work to elderly women of less value in the field is a means simply of increasing efficiencies because they're ensuring that everyone's deployed in some sort of labour. So large plantations had nurseries where babies and children could be cared for en masse. But more attention's been given to the feeding and weaning of babies on plantations, which I don't have time to talk about today, than of older children. So today, then, I do want to focus more on this feeding of older children and how enslavers, are sorting to sort of prioritise, if you like, the feeding of children at minimal cost. Mostly, you get this through WPA evidence. So, for example, Raya Emanuel recalls on her South Carolinian plantation, a woman named Letty, she's named in this case, provided all 3 meals for children in the plantation yard. Breakfast before sunrise, dinner at noon, and then supper before mothers returned from the field. Children fed collectively on her plantation, ate a liquid base of watery meat or vegetable broths, known as pot liquor commonly, or alternatively, perhaps milk, buttermilk or sour milk called clabber. To this base, women added crumbled cornbread, ash cakes, vegetables, occasionally meat scraps. Obviously, this is a really cost-effective way to use up poor quality items of food and possibly spoiled food as well that might otherwise have been fed to animals. And unsurprisingly, these overburdened senior women simply served children's food communally in very large receptacles because it was clearly the sort of easiest option available to them in the face of all their competing caring responsibilities. having to look after these children as well as providing for their nourishment. In contrast to this, we have enslaving men sitting at their writing desks in their plantation homes, issuing prescriptive guidance on plantation management about how enslaved people should be fed, which I'll be coming on to later. Children eating from large containers often called them troughs, which I think is significant. They're significant here. They'd use either their hands, wooden ladles or spoons, sometimes even mussel shells, for example, to eat their food. And it was an easy way, as I said, these big containers of ensuring that, multiple children could be fed simultaneously. Gus Feaster in South Carolina, another WPA respondent, described children eating bread and milk from troughs with a maple bacon spoons after an old lady, again anonymous, had prepared it. Under the watchful eye of the master and mistress, who actually stood and supervised the whole process without doing anything themselves, another woman would then assume responsibility for mopping up spills and cleaning the dirty faces of, he said, up to 15 children at a time. Displaying keen awareness of children's commercial value to enslavers, Mandy Cosby said, Mr. McCulloch raised slaves to sell. She elaborated how an old woman, again nameless, fed children buttermilk with cornbread crumbled into one long trough. They get good care, for the master expects they will bring him good money. This collective feeding of children has had implications for health and hygiene, perhaps something that we're all a lot more aware of since our pandemic. Robert Shepherd recalled an old woman, Aunt Viney, shouting at children when they ate because they rarely washed their hands, and red mud accumulated in the eating trough as well as in their food. The old woman assigned to childcare on Milton Hammond's large plantation found it hard to control children's meal times. The women simply threw the pot liquor into a trough from a big bucket before giving a signal for the children to begin eating, as he said, like a lot of pigs, albeit ones with wooden spoons. In their haste to eat, smaller children jumped into the trough with their presumably dirty feet, perhaps dirty bottoms as well. Adeline Cunningham said field hands often dipped their dirty hands in the children's trough to take their food, leaving her with nothing. Such brutal and animalistic forms of communal eating appear often in WPA testimony. George Womble, enslaved in Georgia, recalls all children eating from a trough with their hands, some even putting their mouths in directly to drink. Plantation dogs and pigs joined in, children tragically trying to protect their faces by holding their hands to their cheeks as they ate. Priscilla Martin, employing a typically dissembling technique of describing cruel practices in the third person, simply said, some enslavers fed people out of troughs, akin to feeding cattle, in her words. More direct was Oscar Felix General's recollection of children fighting over crumbled bread and milk in a trough, just like hogs, he said. They carried on eating even when blood from these fights mingled with the food. Respondents conveyed their memories of feeding in ways that, according to historian Catherine Armstrong, challenge notions of civility. It's a significant point, but I'd go further than this. I think such striking visualizations evokes a strong sense of these children as chattel, commodities to be grown for profit. Respondents did not edit out a collective rhetoric of animalization, even though much of this testimony is shocking, horrific, difficult to read, difficult to talk about as well. Respondents deliberately drew similarities between how they were raised and that of livestock to convey the harshness of the regime, but they did this in a clever way that their mostly white interviewers found palatable, perhaps simply metaphorical even. The interviewees hence conveyed slavery's brutality without upending some of the accepted racial sensibilities of the segregated South in the 1930s. And here I'm inspired by the work of Gregory Smithers, who's written about didactic nature of WPA testimony in relation to forced reproduction. He says that the respondents' memories are marked both by the lived experiences of forced reproduction and by the stories of this reproduction. So they echo it in a way that evokes the language of animal husbandry. And I think we can see the same patterns in interviewees' descriptions of the feeding of children. They use their words carefully, intentionally, deliberately. Children then were described as being fat and sleek, like little black pigs. other respondents talk about enslavers wanting them to grow up fast and strong. We can also sometimes see this language of animalisation within the published autobiographies of enslaved and formerly enslaved people as well. And perhaps it's these works that then later fed into the collective memory of the WPA respondents. We don't know, but I think it is worthy of consideration. Alan Parker's post-Bellum reminiscences detail children's feeding by recording how women poured milk into a container, something like a pig's trough. Each child would be given a piece of hoe cake and an iron spoon and allowed to go to the trough and eat as much as they wanted. Meat was sometimes given, but not very often, and then it only what would be called waste in most families. So it's also the case, as I alluded to earlier, that enslaved women also fed adults as well as children. And my research so far suggests that enslaved women, at least on plantations, tended to prepare and consume breakfast and midday meals, and dinner is known, midday meal is known as dinner rather than an evening meal, whereas the evening meal is known as supper. So that's the sort of terminology they use, which of course is still common in the north of England. So hopefully it's familiar to people here. So you have a situation then where breakfast and the lunchtime dinner, midday dinner, tended to be eaten collectively. Supper is the meal where enslavers are more likely to permit people to eat individually within their own cabins, but not exclusively so. And although I'm not doing any sort of formal quantification of my research here, again, I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A, having been trawling through WPA evidence for forever, at least since the mid-1990s, although not all about this topic, I am confident enough to claim that I think communal modes of eating, especially for all 3 daily meals, was much more common than has hitherto been assumed, and that it was growing on some large plantations over the course of the antebellum era. So here's another example. This is Francis Frederick's autobiography. And I'm not going to read this out just because otherwise I'll go on forever. But this gives us a sort of an example of the sort of the types of food that was eaten and when it was eaten. And of course, what Francis Frederick doesn't actually tell us is who actually prepared and served this food. Again, we've got this anonymity of the enslaved women involved, even among their enslaved peers here. Looking at advice collated in collections such as James Breeden's Advice Among Masters, as well as manuscript materials in archives, practices clearly varied. But over the course of the antebellum era, enslavers moved then towards more institutional, more regimented forms of communal eating over time, with the rhetoric of maternalism tending to label evening eating within people's own cabins as a form of privilege for which people should feel grateful. And this also relates as well, of course, to how enslaved people lived. Most enslavers over the course of the antebellum era in the US South, they moved away from a more barrack-style accommodation. A good example of this is provided by Thomas Jefferson, who did this in the 1790s. And as people then moved into more familial-based cabins, they wanted this privilege of evening eating on their own. That said, I am finding more examples than I thought I might of enslaved people still living communally in larger single cabins that house much more than just sort of 1 or 2 families. Especially on smaller slaveholdings, you might get all enslaved people living in a large sort of shared or almost dormitory style. So to me, that has real echoes of this sort of barrack style living that's more common in enslaved people and slave regimes elsewhere in the Atlantic world. So J. Hume Simon then, in his Planter's Guide, he advised preparing all food cooked together and served at regular times to save money and lead to healthier people. Prescriptive writings such as these are idealised, conveying a sense of competitiveness, I think, among enslavers about whose routines might have the best outcomes in terms of profitability. Reading their really pompous prose, their high-handed rules and regulations around feeding, I'm struck by the way in which this evidence jars when compared to the sentiments of the formerly enslaved when they're talking about food. Here, we're talking about hunger, drudgery, monotony, everyday routines. So, for example, Nathan Bast, not to go backwards again, a Georgian enslaver, advised that enslaved people should be allowed sufficient wholesome food, not omitting a good supply of vegetables, and a regular cook whose duty it should be to have all their provisions well cooked. 19th century people as a whole, they thought everything should be well cooked, and served up at regular hours for them. He also suggested that requiring each one to cook their own provisions is highly objectionable. It's always done in a hurry, consequently in a very imperfect manner, throwing their bacon on the embers, their bread in the ashes. Economy, as well as humanity, here we see the rhetoric of paternalism, would condemn such a practice, for it is not only a great waste, but the very imperfect manner in which their food is cooked must be unhealthy. So this is really offensive to read, of course. Enslaved people simply had to cook in a hurry with little free time. Preparing food in the ashes of open fires in cabins was a really practical solution to a lack of equipment. Moreover, I think Bass's really casual aside that the woman tasked with preparing and serving food could, as he said, additionally take care of the children, whilst females labour in the field, exposes again enslavers' lack of regard for these highly gendered forms of labour. An unnamed Virginian author also ignored women's labour when he wrote in 1937 that their food should be cooked for them twice a day and carried out to the field. It's a general custom in this state to have their food cooked but once a day and to require each enslaved person to cook for himself, and note the male pronoun here, at night and carry with him his food for the morning's meal in the field the next day. At other times, women or children might be deployed to take all the food together to the field in large pots or other receptacles. Sometimes they also carried babies for mothers to breastfeed from plantation nurseries. So, here again, then we see, how great enslavers' desire is simply to minimise all time that's spent away from work. So, where people ate collectively away from the fields, this tended to be in plantation yards near the big house. Sometimes enslavers provided communal eating houses, dining areas, or shaded and sheltered spots in plantation yard. On the Bullett's Oxmoor plantation in Kentucky, a dinner signal rang at 12 o'clock and people came to eat in the enslaved people's kitchen. Enslaved people on Molly Taylor's Texan plantation likewise had one room for cooking, where a woman prepared meals, and a separate eating room where people dined. So the location of these communal kitchens and dining facilities in what Catherine Armstrong again refers to as a sort of liminal space between the quarters and the house. Again, it shows us how enslavers are seeking to heighten their control and authority, but I think as well it also shows us racism because they want separate kitchens, separate dining areas. They don't like cooks for the quarters to be preparing food where the plantation cook is cooking for white families. And sometimes too, we also get real sort of tragic evidence within enslaved and formerly enslaved people's testimony about parents going without food to supplement their children's diets. So I think perhaps it's unsurprising that we might see a trope of a self-sacrificial mother in published autobiographies, whether this is Charles Ball, Harriet Jacobs, or Frederick Douglass. An unnamed author as well also recalled an old woman cooking for children on his South Carolinian plantation. He said that here, enslaved people ate just 2 meals a day. There was no evening supper. They never gave us anything at night. Sometimes mothers would save a piece of ash cake to give to their children. That's all they can do for them. And of course, it's true that fathers as well as mothers might have gone without food to ensure their children had enough nourishment. But I think a lot of the habits around eating within more private quarters of enslaved communities do still remain hidden from history. And I want to sort of finish off today, hopefully I'm right for time. I want to just sort of say a few more points about this, perhaps a bit more speculative research. Women found their own cabins a place of refuge within which they could prepare and cook food autonomously, away from enslavers' attempts to dictate how they ate. Yet the preparation of evening suppers within cabins imposed an additional gendered workload upon women, even as it simultaneously granted them a degree of autonomy and relative privacy. I haven't found any evidence of men cooking in the quarters in the evenings. Most women cooked on an open fire using a 3-legged cooking pot, sometimes known as a spider. They cooked one-pot soups and stews slowly and flexibly, and these meals they could be left unattended while women performed other chores, other caring responsibilities. Such techniques also helped tenderize poor quality meats and vegetables, as did enlivening the flavors with herbs, spices, and supplementing meals with produce from gardens. Archaeological work at Monticello, I did a lot of research about this project in Monticello a couple of years ago, by Diana Crader, revealed butchery marks suggesting pork was cooked in one-pot meals and cooked so thoroughly that it simply fell off the bone. And as I said, this made life easier for women undertaking multiple forms of caring labour. The meal simply simmered away while women performed their other evening chores, whether this is tending to children, cleaning, or tidying up. They stored their food in root cellars underneath cabins, enabling food to be protected from heat and rain. Yet at the same time, I do think it's important that we don't romanticize women's cooking in the quarters. Evening meals, while they represented a concession to food autonomy, and it was a simultaneous shifting of responsibility for nourishment onto already exhausted enslaved women, exposing the duality, if you like, of feeding. Food preparation imposed a disproportionate burden upon women, and they regarded this in complex ways. As Josephine Bioku-Betts has written into her studies of Gullah communities in South Carolina and Georgia, whether in the past or the present, food preparation perpetuates gender inequalities, but simultaneously provides women with identity, a source of empowerment, a means to perpetuate group survival. I think women employed more communal cooking techniques and modes of eating in relation to their evening suppers than we have previously assumed. Henry Bullitt, in his reminiscences growing up on the Oxmoor plantation in Louisville, described how following the weekend allocations of rations, cooking practices varied. Some cooked for themselves, others would club together, he wrote, adding they preferred such a system to the old plan of a communal kitchen of old. So this shows us again what enslaved people wanted to do. And then it's also important here, of course, that family structures among the enslaved could be very complicated due to enforced sales and separations, hiring out, a system of abroad marriages that I've written about before, voluntary separations and deaths. Enslaved people's cabins might contain extended family units, members of multiple households, lodgers, other single people, for example, as Charles Ball wrote about. These necessarily flexible and adaptable familial and community networks also render more typically Western notions of households as nuclear in scope rather than helpful for conceptualizing how enslaved people lived and ate in the quarters. I draw upon the anthropological work of Nyara Sudakasa here, writing about West Africa initially and then sort of transporting these ideas onto the US. She believed that on some larger US plantations, extended kin networks meant the enslaved lived in bigger familial compounds, separate but adjoining intertwined households where people ate together and shared child raising. Likewise, the African concept of a hearthhold, centering a fire where food is prepared communally, contained more than one household. And within them, multiple women could have played a central role controlling the hearth and preparing food upon it. The WPA respondent Easter Wells remembered more collective forms of eating in the quarters. And importantly, of course, this is communal eating that comes from enslaved people's own volition, rather than that dictated by enslavers that I talked about earlier. She said everyone ate outside together, having prepared food together using communal utensils. Jessica Harris, writing more generally, claimed that enslaved people quite understandably preferred to cook together outdoors after dark, especially in warmer weather. And more tentatively, perhaps there may also be some pre-industrial Western European traditions at play here. For example, some WPA respondents talk about bread being cooked in large communal ovens, which meant I could go down the corridor and talk to my colleague who's a French historian about some of these traditions. So to finish off then, I think the enslaved women's feeding practices can be a very elusive topic to research. It's constrained by what we know are archival silences, also the priorities and agendas of those who wrote the primary sources, and the subsequent interests of historians are problematic as well. Many of them have overlooked the gendered dimensions of food distribution, preparation, and consumption. Cooks in the quarters, in contrast to cooks for enslavers, have remained largely invisible, despite the crucial, multifaceted and arduous caring aspects of this important gendered work. The lens of food allows us to consider the complex relationships between women, food and power, and the intersection of racial and gendered oppression. Enslavers weaved food into their efforts to control through systems of rewards and incentives, as well as delegating labour they perceived as domestic to enslaved women under the guise of autonomy and independence, all in the pursuit of efficiencies. And incidentally, just my final point, I'd really like to see more archivists and those compiling book indexes, including these examples within their records, examples of wet nurses, cooks who prepared food for the enslaved, and those who cared for enslaved children where they've been found. It's a problem for a lot of us who work on women's history that nothing is indexed. So I've been really pleased that some archivists in the US have responded positively to my requests, such as here we've got an example from the Filson in Kentucky, so we can move forward towards more inclusive and more accessible histories. Thank you.